I'm Professor Kirk Hawkins in the Department of Political Science here at BYU, and our speaker today is here as part of a conference studying the causes of populism, and that conference is the reflection of a work of a network of scholars called Team Populism, an international network. Many of them are here in the audience today, and it's an exciting time for us to be together working and sharing our research. Let me introduce our speaker today. Say a few brief words about my colleague and friend, Mudde. Professor Mudde, he is an associate professor in the School of Public and International Affairs at the University of Georgia and a researcher at the brand new Center for Research on Extremism at the University of Oslo. He's written a bit on populism. His book, Populist Radical Right Parties in Europe, won the very prestigious Stein Rokkan Prize for Comparative Social Science Research in 2008. He's written additional books on populism. More recently, Populism in Europe and the Americas, Threat or Corrective for Democracy, which he co-authored with our good friend Cristobal Rovira-Kaltwasser, Political Extremism, Youth and the Extreme Right, On Extremism and Democracy in Europe, and most recently, The Contemporary Radical Right, a reader. He's still doing work on populism, has a few books on that coming out, and also, interestingly, on the Israeli settler movement. That's some of his most recent research, and he'll have a book there at Cambridge University Press. Professor Mudde also is a frequent consultant to policymakers and politicians in Europe who are concerned about especially the radical right and populism more generally, and to policymakers in the United States. Notice I didn't say politicians here in the United States. We still struggle a bit to listen to our scholars as much as we should. And Professor Mudde also happens to be kind of a practitioner of populism himself in his love of sports. Get him on the subject of soccer or football, for example, and I think he'll see what I mean. I think that's enough of an introduction. Cas, we'll turn the time over to you.
Thank you very much. Okay, thanks for that very nice introduction and for bringing me back to Provo, this time in full snow. My apologies that I wasn't here yesterday, but I think you have to take that up with Delta and not with me. Given the audience, this is going to be a bit of a weird talk because half of the audience are people who study populism who probably know the answer to the question posed here, which is actually a question, but for aesthetical reasons, I didn't want to put a question mark behind populism. In the end, PowerPoints are about aesthetics first and foremost. So, question, which actually we should always ask, like whenever we do something, is we should ask, why do we study something? And if we don't necessarily ask it for ourselves, we should ask it for anyone who we want to address it to, as one of the things that my undergraduate students often do not understand. They just think that if you're interested in it, then everyone else is interested in it. And then I have to struggle for all kinds of papers. So why do we study populism? Now, the first reason is because populism is everywhere, at least in the public debate. This is random. I can find all kinds of different examples, but what this actually shows is, first of all, there are different sources. Right? Even in the Jordan Times, they're talking about Latin American populism. Populism is very big at the moment in the US, even though it's misguided because it's all about Sanders and Trump, and I don't think either of them is a populist, but it doesn't matter. Populism is being discussed the whole time. A lot of resonance over this, but the second reason why populism should be studied is because it's considered to be dangerous for democracy. With a whole list of books and articles about it. By and large, the interest in populism, very broad, is almost always linked to the idea that populism is, in one way or another, challenging, if not threatening, to democracy. And so those are two of the reasons what drew me to populism. I saw it being used the whole time, and yet either not defined or defined in very different ways. And I saw it being linked as a threat. And so from my own personal interest, I am actually not generally so worried about alleged threats to democracy. I'm worried about responses to those threats, which often undermine democracy much more than the threat itself. And so one of the reasons that drew me into populism was, if everyone says that this is very dangerous, they're going to do things that might actually be more dangerous. So what I'm going to talk about today: what is populism? Who are the populists? How popular are populists? What are the causes of populist mobilization? And what are the consequences of populist politics for democracy? Now, that's quite a lot for 30 minutes, so it's going to be very quick. And if you want any details on certain issues, please save that for the Q&A and we'll talk about it. It is important to note here that much of the scholarship that I present now has come through an incredibly fruitful, intellectual as well as personally very satisfying collaboration with that man there, Cristobal Rovira Kalkwasser, with whom I have worked over the past years, and it really has developed my thinking about populism a lot. So what is populism? Now, when you look at pieces about populism, the vast majority don't have a definition. We don't have the same. And so that is one of the reasons why I have to come up with a definition. And I present now a definition here, which is used by some scholars, but is by far away from a consensual definition. There is no consensual definition, but it is a definition that is being used by people throughout the world and can be applied in very different contexts, and I think that's one of the major advantages. And so populism is a fin-centered ideology that considers society to be ultimately separated into two homogeneous and antagonistic groups: the pure people on one hand and the corrupt elite on the other, and which argues that politics should be an expression of the volonté générale, or the general will of the people. A couple of key aspects here. First of all, ideology is by and large a worldview. And so when you have a worldview, it means that it influences the way you perceive the world. It guides you. It guides in what you see and what you want to do about it. Absolutely crucial is homogeneous and antagonistic. So the people are seen as having all the same values and by and large interests. Every individual within the people. Consequently, populists believe in a general will. That means that they think that the people as a collective actually have one will. And that means that you can come up with policies that are good for everyone. Now, our normal understanding of society and the people in liberal democracy is a pluralist understanding, which thinks that society exists of many different groups that have different values and different interests. And politics is generally made out of a compromise between some of those groups. So it's a very different type of understanding. The relationship between populism and democracy is always discussed. In this understanding, populism is pro-democracy but anti-liberal democracy. Now let me shortly explain what that means. Democracy is here defined in a very minimal way, pretty much as popular sovereignty and majority rule, which means that the democratic ideal is that the people can elect their representatives. Liberal democracy is a much broader system and is much more reflective of what the US has, or most of Western Europe, or what most of the other countries aspire to. And they combine popular sovereignty and majority rule with things like minority rights and pluralism. Populism accepts that the people elect their leaders, but they have almost a kind of an extreme majoritarianism. They think that if the majority wants to do something, the minority shouldn't be able to oppose that. And so the concept of minority rights is at odds with it. Populism can be left or right, depending on the host ideology. By host ideology, I mean that most populist actors actually are not just populist, they share that, they combine that with another ideology. Most right-wing populists share it with some form of nationalism. Most left-wing populists share it with some form of socialism. Today, populism is more left-wing in the south and more right-wing in the north. And that applies to both in Europe and the Americas. And so within the US today, populism is more associated with the right, like the Tea Party, and however falsely I think with Trump, although he comes close. Northern Europe, you have mostly right-wing or what we call far-right populist parties. Think about the Sweden Democrats, Party for Freedom. Whereas in the South, particularly Latin America, presidents like Morales in Bolivia or before the now late Chavez in Venezuela are left-wing populist, and in the south of Europe, we're talking about Syriza or Podemos. And so it comes in very different shapes. What they all share is that vision of populism, that vision of a pure people versus a corrupt elite. So populism in the world, this is going to move very fast, but just so that you have a bit of an understanding of how relevant is this. Now, North America, and particularly the US, has a very deep, populism has very deep and long roots in society. It dates back to the late 19th century, at least, with the People's Party. And you see it in all kinds of cultural things, in books and literature and movies. There are certain expressions that politicians have been using for a very long time, oppositions between kind of the pure people in the rural areas and the corrupt people in the cities, is one of the things that I always find striking, is how often you see that in movies. And so I think one of the most populist movies ever made is Sweet Home Alabama with Reese Witherspoon, I think. What was that about? Populism? Actually, yes. And so Reese Witherspoon was this pure, blonde little girl, because it is Hollywood. And she grew up, and she was all with other really pure people, and everything was idyllic, but silly girl wanted more in life and went into the city. There, as we all know, in the city are the elite. They're all corrupt with money. And so she goes there, forgets her root, becomes corrupted, not a nice person, and then by and large, for reasons, whatever, has to go back, and then refines herself and becomes purified again. And it's a beautiful, typical example of American populism. But the thing is, although populism is very strong in culture, actually in terms of political success, it is pretty rare. And it's in part because of the two-party system. But so populism is here as a political force, not as strong. It's actually much stronger in South America, where it had three waves roughly since the early 20th century, a more left-wing wave in the early 20th century, then in the late 20th century, a right-wing wave, more on neoliberalism, and then the wave that we have today in the 21st century is again left-wing. It is in Latin America's most politics very much directed and linked to specific individuals, mostly presidents. Now, despite the fact that it has been very successful, at times it's also very much overstated. Even today, where we have a very large success, there's still only a few countries where actually there are populist presidents. There are a lot of countries, more, that don't have any significant populist actor. It's always kind of important to remember. Populism was pretty marginal in Europe for much of its history, which has a lot to do with the way that democracy was introduced in Europe, which was more gradual. Most political families were very paternalistic, didn't really believe that the people could decide for themselves. And that extended from the Social Democrats to the Christian Democrats. There were some more marginal agrarians in Eastern Europe that were populist, but that was at a time of authoritarianism. and so they weren't particularly relevant. It has exploded in the late 1980s, early 1990s, and so to the level that today we could speak about a populist zeitgeist in Europe, meaning that populism is now so broadly used that it's almost difficult to just distinguish between parties for which this is a core ideology and politicians who just use this because everyone talks this way these days. And so you will have the example of, which is the US rather than Europe, but just think about the GOP primary at the moment going on, right? And you have senators running against the Senate. Right? If you hear Cruz talking about Washington and about senators, you would completely forget that that is actually, he is one of them. Right? In Europe, you have mainstream political politicians who have done nothing else in their life than be a politician, talking about politicians as if they're all corrupt and as if they're not part of it. And so populism is today kind of a current. At the same time, what populist parties, so parties for whom populism is actually a core part of their ideology, are not the main parties in most countries. But virtually every European country has some populist party. Now in the rest of the world, populism is still relatively limited. There are a couple of examples like Thaksin Shinawatra in Thailand. Australia had some, but you see it emerge. And one of the reasons why it is not that strong yet in certain areas is that populism is very much linked to democracy. Like the argument of populism, of that the people and the general will should decide, does need at least some larger understanding that democracy is a good form of politics. So this is a quick overview to just give you from Europe. It doesn't really matter much, but what the percentage EP 2014, what that means is that that is the percentage that the various populist parties in that country got in the 2014 elections for the European Parliament. Now, there are a couple of things out there. Parties that are in black are what we generally call far-right parties. Parties in blue are right-wing populist parties. In red are left-wing populist parties. And the green ones are kind of idiosyncratic. They're very difficult to place. What you see is an enormous difference. And so this is going from non-existent to the majority in Hungary. Right? It's non-existent in certain countries. Actually excluded them here, but you don't see some of the countries. And you see a huge range. 4.1% in Belgium, for example, right? But overall, populist parties are now reasonably established players in a majority of European countries. And the reason why that's relevant is in most countries, they're not in the government. Actually, in only a few countries, populists are in government. But even if they're not in government, by challenging electorally the mainstream parties, they can force them to adopt some of their rhetoric. And so populism is clearly relevant within European politics. Now, the question then becomes, why are they successful? But also, why are they successful now? Like many of our explanations, why could they potentially be successful? But actually, populism, particularly in European context, but outside of Latin America, by and large, populism is a relatively modern phenomenon in terms of electoral success. And so these explanations come a little bit more from the European literature, but I think they can be broader applied. Now, the first one is that important issues are not adequately addressed by elites. Now, this sounds much clearer than it is, because this is defined by the voter. Right? So every individual voter will think what are important issues and not. And they will establish whether it is adequately addressed or not. And so today, for example, there's a huge portion of people that think that Islam is not adequately addressed in the Netherlands. And yet, I cannot open any newspaper that doesn't talk about Islam, right? And so, as in politics, it's not so much about what really happens, it's how it's perceived. And so there are now people who perceive that their issues are not adequately addressed by the elites. Even more important, elites are perceived as being all the same. And a good example is what you see there, l'UMPS, which is actually, there used to be at least two big parties in France. One was the right-wing UMP and the other one was the left-wing PS. And the populists, particularly the Front National, the right-wing populists, have put them together and they speak about the UMPS. And the point that they make by that is that these two parties are really just one. Those elites that say that they're really different, in essence, they're the same. And in essence, they're all corrupt. And so when they talk about politics, it's not about free parties. It's not about Front National, UMP, and PS. It's about the Front National standing as the voice of the people versus l'UMPS, the bloc of elite. And the idea is that the elites are all the same. Now, this is in part a consequence of coalition government in many countries. It's also in part because of the narrowing of politics. And particularly within the European context, but more broadly, globalization or Europeanization have limited options, or at least the political elite believes that it has more limited options in policies. And that means that today, whether the left or the right governs has much less influence on what the policies are than in the 50s or the 60s. And that, of course, helps the populists to make that point. There's also a more positive underpinning to this. People have more political efficacy, more political self-confidence. The American political scientist Russell Dalton describes the process of cognitive mobilization. He does this mostly in the context of Western democracies. It has to do with the fact that more education has made people less beholden to traditional structures and more self-confident about their own abilities. I think particularly when you look at a West European context, it's very important. Right? In the 1950s, 60s, 70s still, many peoples would vote according to what their trade union or their priest would say. They would not feel that they were competent to judge whether political matters were going well. Today, across the world, not just in the highest educated, many people feel that they can make that choice. Consequently, they're much more independent and much more critical towards the elites. And that has opened them up to an actor like Populist. Populist actors have become more attractive. I mean, whether or not we can measure charisma, charismatic leadership is absolutely a part of certain populist movements. I mean, many people in Venezuela saw Chavez as being special. Like, someone like Jörg Haider, the leader of the Austrian Freedom Party, a right-wing populist party, was considered to be someone who was better than other politicians. Populist politicians and populist parties tend to be actually often in their country among the better ones in the use of social media, the better ones in the use of debates. Again, Trump is not the best example of a populist, but think about him as an example of how he uses the media. And that comes to the fact that the media structure is also much more favorable to populists. Most populists, first of all, are challengers. Now, until the 1980s, most media systems were very closed. They were mostly controlled by the mainstream parties. And that meant that even if you were around as a populist, no one knew, because you couldn't get your story into the news. Today, First of all, there's much more private media, which is less concerned with that, and more importantly, the logic of the private media is much better for populists. The logic of the private media is to sell, right? And so what sells? Controversy. And populists provide controversy. State media, which were dominant in a lot of Western Europe for decades, don't have an economic logic. Even if today the media isn't really open, and most media are still part of the establishment, and I think the best example was that The Guardian, which is a left-wing British newspaper and a newspaper of record for any intellectual in Britain, has always been very, very critical of pretty much everything, the established parties. But as soon as actually left-wing populism came up, they spoke out against it. Even though if you would have read The Guardian for years, you would think, oh, that is exactly what they wanted. But when push comes to shove, Guardian is still the voice of mainstream parties. The point is, mainstream media cannot ignore anything that gets a lot of attention outside of it. And so if there is a major phenomenon on social media, it will be picked up by the mainstream media. Because if you don't do that, people are not going to reach you, you lose your revenue, and you go bankrupt, right? Now, there are two extremely good examples of it. I mean, the man down there, like Trump showed it yesterday again, like, doesn't go to a debate, then comes up with some own event, and CNN covers that, right? Geert Wilders, who is the populist leader in the Netherlands, hasn't given an interview for years. The only thing that he did was tweet. He would by and large just tweet something, very good tweets actually, I mean, good in the sense of doing exactly what he wanted to, say something controversial, regular journalists would pick it up, and then go to mainstream politicians and say, Geert Wilders just tweeted that. What do you think about that? And so the whole story was about Geert Wilders, right? That is what the new media structure allows. It allows people who actually the mainstream media would like to ignore, like make it virtually impossible for them to ignore. And so this is, these are all connected, right? Remarkable is actually that we have very few really good, clear theoretical models of why populism is successful. We have some loose points, but how it exactly works, we still don't really know that much. We know a little bit more about the consequences. Now, the effects of populism on democracy are actually pretty complex. Because democracy can also be seen as a process. And so in a forthcoming book, Christobal and I have laid this out in this process. And by and large, what this means is that depending on the stage of democratization of the process of becoming democratic, populism plays different roles, sometimes very supportive of democracy, sometimes less. I focus here specifically on the consequences of populism on liberal democracy. And again, as everyone, because I'm covering a lot, these are just some points, and everything obviously is much more complex. The first thing, and probably the best and most positive aspect of populism, is that it repoliticizes or it politicizes certain issues. What I mean by that is that there are certain issues that the established parties will not address. It doesn't have to be a conspiracy. They might just not see it because it happens among people that they're not interested in. But sometimes it is a conspiracy. Immigration, as well as European integration, were kept off the agenda consciously by the mainstream parties in various countries. They made explicit deals not to talk about it. The argument was that it would create nationalism and all kind of other things, but there was actually a very self-serving motivation under it as well. The parties knew that their own electorates were divided over those issues. And so they were afraid that it would divide their electorates. Populists come in and say, no, I want to talk about this. Another thing that happens is that quite a lot of issues that used to be political have now become non-political. Thank you. And a lot of these are in the economic sphere or in the legal sphere. Two examples: the death penalty. This country is one of the few democracies that has the death penalty. European countries don't have it. And actually, if you become a member of the Council of Europe, it's an overarching organization, which is actually not that relevant. You have to sign, you have to agree that you don't have the death penalty. Often when there is a debate about it, and people will say we should bring back the death penalty, mainstream politicians will say, well, you can't do that because we're part of the Council of Europe and we can't have the death penalty. And populists will then say, well, then we should get out of the Council of Europe. Right? What they by and large say is, this is a political issue. We should be able to decide about this. Now, in the economic sphere, particularly within the European Union, a lot of issues are now put into non-political units. In many countries, the central bank, like here the Fed, is a non-political unit. Now, the consequences of the policies of the Fed are huge, right? Deciding about inflation, deciding about exchange rate things, which sets all kinds of consequences. And so when you talk about these things, politicians will say, well, I can't say anything about that. That is the prerogative of the European Central Bank, and that's a non-political institution. And populists will say, no, that's undemocratic. We should repoliticize that. We should make those decisions. Right? And so in that sense, they play a role in furthering democracy. A consequence of populism is polarization of the political debate. In part, this is the case because they think in categories of the pure people and the corrupt elite. Now, if one group is corrupt and one group is pure, compromise becomes impossible. When the pure compromises with the corrupt, the pure is corrupted. And so in that type, populists often use very strong words to the other group. Opponents are enemies, or as the former Minister of Finance in Greece called his opponents terrorists, right? And that generally leads to a response on the other side. And so anti-populist, mainstream parties become anti-populist, which polarizes the debate. I think Venezuela is a very good example where it's just the debate is, are you for or against Chavez? There are no issues. Earlier in Slovakia, you had exactly the same. You were either for Mečiar or you were against Mečiar. There were no middle grounds. The whole debate was no longer about finding a compromise between that. There were just two poles. And of course, polarization is a major problem. I mean, first of all, it can undermine coalitions, which are necessary to govern the country. It can lead to more violence. It can lead to political dissatisfaction. Generally, what we see is when populist actors become more powerful, either strong enough to push for a people's initiative, or if they have the power, you see an increased use of plebiscitarian instruments, which are most notably referendums. They're used pretty opportunistic, though. In most cases, referendums are only called if they know that they're going to win, or they're ignored when the outcome isn't good enough. Greece, to a certain extent, again, being a very good example, where Syriza, the populist left party, right, had a bailout with pretty strong austerity consequences to it. And so then they didn't want to do that and say, well, we don't have a democratic mandate for this. We have to organize a referendum. They did that, and wonderfully, actually, they did it in a week, which was quite impressive that they pulled that off. And the vast majority of the Greeks said, yeah, you're right, we shouldn't accept this deal. But then 2 weeks later, they still accepted the deal. And so while plebiscitarian instruments are all about getting the general will, in practice, they're actually used often very opportunistically. Now, when populists get into power, what you see is a weakening of non-majoritarian institutions, or at least the attempt. One of the things that they always go after are courts. One of the big frustrations of populists are courts, like the Supreme Court, for example. Right? Why do 9 unelected people have the right to make this decision? Now, obviously, you only really do that when the court doesn't do what you want, right? Because when the Supreme Court upholds what you believe in, they are actually the voice of the people. Now, what you see in the courts is what they try to do 2 things. First of all, for which you often need a larger majority, is change its powers. Just give it less power. In Hungary, Viktor Orban, by and large, decided that the Supreme Court can no longer speak about all kinds of important issues. But if you don't have that power, which often is a constitutional amendment, you replace the people in the court. You can do that with 2 ways. If you can, you retire some and put new people in. If you can't retire those people, you just appoint more people. So if you have 9 people, of whom about 7 are against you, right, you just have to make sure that there are more people so that in the end, you put 10 more in it, and then it's 12 against 7, and you have a majority again. And so one of the things that you see with populists is generally undermine the power of forces, institutions that could be against their policies, or they appoint people in all kinds of positions so that those organizations will do what they want. The same with the media. Freedom of press is always under pressure when populists come to power. Again, in 2 ways. It can be in pure censorship, where you just close down newspapers or media or fire people. But that is very tricky, particularly if you work in a larger structure like the European Union. That can lead to court cases and all kinds of political trouble. So you can do another thing, and that's use the tax policies. And Putin is a master of this, but many others do this too. You send the IRS, version of the IRS, on these organizations. Now, in many countries, corruption is widespread. So if you send the IRS, you will find corruption. That's not the point, right? The point is you only send the IRS on those you don't like. Or you threaten, and that is enough. In Hungary, the whole state media has been completely put in service of the Fidesz government. Every single important person there is appointed by Fidesz. But much of the other media is still the same people. But pretty much they self-censor, because they knew if they don't, they're going to have trouble. How successful they are has a lot to do with how much power they have. In many cases, populists are in the government, but they're in a coalition government. And the other partner is not populist and will not want to support that. In other cases, you have an overarching organization. And so I think some of the more extreme situations are definitely Hungary and Venezuela. Now, the ultimate, what can happen when populists are in power, and pretty much in absolute power, having a constitutional majority, is that you will see a slow transformation into an illiberal democracy. And with an illiberal democracy, I mean that the people still vote, and the majority still decides who is in power, but minority rights are undermined and increasingly, actually, it becomes more and more difficult to really decide who wins. Like if your whole media is controlled by the government party, if opposition politicians are being threatened by either the tech services or by the police, you can even get into what is called a competitive authoritarian regime, where you still have elections, but actually the outcome will not change anymore. So that is exactly why, right, we're all worried about it. But it is important that the effects are dual. So in conclusion, although populism is broadly used as Germans call Kampfbegriff, or a concept in the struggle, in the political struggle, it can actually be clearly defined and it can be used in political analysis. Populism is not just a derogative term. It actually can be used in a more neutral way. Its main importance is in terms of its relationship with democracy and liberal democracy, and that relationship is actually quite complex. So populism can both be a corrective for liberal democracy and a threat to liberal democracy. It can be a corrective, most notably by repoliticizing or by politicizing issues that are believed as important by parts of the population, but that are either willingly or unwillingly ignored by the mainstream parties. It can be a threat to liberal democracy by undermining pretty much all the countervailing powers or checks and balances, if you have that type of system, to particularly executive power. And finally, I think populism is best perceived as an illiberal democratic response to undemocratic liberalism. Now, it's not just a play of words, there's actually a thought behind that. So the illiberal democratic response, I think I've explained, right? So it is very much about the majority deciding, and the illiberal part is not wanting to listen to minorities or not wanting to have constraints on majority power. But they do generally respond to an undemocratic liberalism, by which I mean that be it either a liberalism that, for example, says that issues like the death penalty should not be decided by the people. These are so important values that they should be taken out of the democratic or the electoral agenda. Alternatively, from a neoliberal perspective, all those kind of independent agencies that are incredibly important for economic policies, independent central banks, IMF, whatever it is, right? Those type of influence. Those come from a neoliberal ideology, but these organizations are undemocratic in the sense that people do not have power over them through elections. And so it is because of the increased push of undemocratic liberalism that populism rises and what it responds to. Thank you.